أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. And thank you very much for joining us today in what will prove to be a fantastic discussion around the COVID-19 vaccination. And I'm going to be your host tonight. My name is Dr. Abbas Tijani. Some of you may know me from our recitations and recordings of albums along with my brother Dr. Shabir Tijani. But tonight I come to you from my medical and educational background. I've been working as a frontline doctor for the last 10 years, serving as a GP, an occupational physician, as well as being an honorary senior lecturer at the Leicester Medical School. I'm delighted to be joined by two eminent members of our community. We have Sheikh Ja'far Ladak, who is the resident alim of Stanmore Jamaat, and we have Brother Ali Akbar Datu, who is a global health researcher and an epidemiologist who brings with him a wealth of medical and educational knowledge around the COVID vaccine. My plea to all of you who are tuning in and watching from home is please approach these discussions, what we're about to hear and see over the coming hour or 2 hours, with an open mind. Approach this with an open mind. I know that there are lots and lots of questions that we have, and inshallah, we'll try to get through them as quickly as we can. Inshallah, I want to hand over to Brother Tawfiq to lay down a few ground rules and just go through a bit of discussion about how the format of tonight is going to run. I'll then start off with Tilawat of Quran, and then hand over to Brother Ali Akbar Datu, followed by Sheikh Ja'far, and then I myself will give a presentation, and then we'll open up the forum for a question and answer session. So do stay tuned. If there's anything you don't understand or want us to explain more, please use your Q&A function that you have available. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Brother Tawfiq first and foremost.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. On behalf of the Council of European Jamaats, I'd like to first of all thank our esteemed panel today, especially Brother Asad Abdullah, who has done a lot of the work in the background, Dr. Abbas Tijani, Dr. Ali Akbar Datu, and Sheikh Ja'far Ladak for agreeing to come and discuss this really important topic that has impacted the world. And of course, the vaccination is now about to start, and it has already started being given out here in the UK and across the world. Inshallah, we are going to have it's going to be a live event, so you will be able to ask questions. You will notice on the live event in itself there is a button where you can press and ask your questions directly, which will come here to us. And inshallah, what we will do is when we gather questions, we will then start publishing them. And the way to get involved then is we would like you to please press the like button on some of the questions that are coming through. And what we will try and do is try and answer as many questions that have been put forward, inshallah. What we will also do is we will publish some of these questions so that you, the public, can decide what questions we should put up to the panel, inshallah. We will try and also get the questions of our YouTube channel, as this is now also being streamed on our YouTube channel, inshallah. So we will keep an eye on that, and we'll try and answer those questions. So without further ado, I will hand you back to today's host, Dr. Abbas Tijani. Please welcome him with the nar salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So just start with Tilawat of Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is a global health researcher, an infectious diseases epidemiologist, Brother Ali Akbar Datu. And I want you all to welcome him with a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil faraj.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Excellent. Just getting my slides up, if you just give me one moment. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So my name is Ali Akbar Datu. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist and global health researcher. I'm currently working for Public Health England as an epidemiologist in the field services team, but I also have clinical research experience with medical devices. And I attained my master's degree from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So to begin tonight's talk, I thought I'd begin to explain what an actual vaccine is. We've heard a lot about vaccinations and vaccines and the COVID virus, but I thought I'd just begin the basics. So vaccination is a medical technique that uses a body's own immune system to protect it from either invasive pathogens or infectious diseases. A vaccine introduces a weakened or inactive version of the infection into the body. Now, it basically enables our body to react to this in weakened or inactive version of the infection and creates little molecules called antibodies that can protect us from further infection. Now, I'll get to the logistics of that in just a second. But before that, I thought I'd start with some history. Vaccines. They've been around since the 18th century, believe it or not. Now, one of the first instances of vaccination was from someone known as Dr. Edward Jenner. Now, he was a physician in the early 18th century, and he found that this was around the time when smallpox was quite a large disease in the population. Now, his theory was that there was milkmaids who worked in fields with cows, and he found that they were actually protected against this virus or smallpox virus, and he wanted to know why. So he figured he'd try and find out. And at the time, he postulated that there was another virus that only infected cows called cowpox. And he thought, well, what if I try and inoculate a child against this smallpox virus by using this other virus known as cowpox? And he tried this, as you can see in the little image in the presentation. He inoculated the child against smallpox using the cowpox virus. This actually worked. Now, this predates any of our modern medical technologies, and we've refined this over time to get to where we are today. There has been many global health successes on the back of this. Since then, we've managed to eliminate smallpox, and that was in the 1980s, and that's an incredible feat on its own. Alongside that, we have the polio eradication campaign. Now, this started around the 1950s. There was two vaccines. There was the Salk and the Sabin vaccine. Both use slightly different methods with varying levels of effectiveness. Personally, I think the Sabin vaccine was quite good. Since then, we've actually managed to eradicate polio from a lot of the parts of the world. Now, keep in mind, since 2012, there's been endemic polio in about 4 countries of the world. This includes Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan, and India. Now, this isn't based on medical terms, but more to do with the geopolitical aspects of the time in these specific nations. But all in all, this disease was probably not in my lifetime, but my parents' lifetime. And I'm sure that some of you in the audience were actually present at the time when those vaccination campaigns were going on. So it's quite a miracle to see that we don't really see this in mainstream, medical field anymore, aside from, small pockets in the world. Another great success is the Ebola virus. Now, this popped up in 2014. And I'm sure a lot of you remember that time. There's a lot going on in Sierra Leone with up to 11,000 cases of this very, very infectious Ebola virus. Since then, there's been pockets of outbreaks. Most recently, the Democratic Republic of Congo went through this. And great news amongst COVID this year has been that we managed to end the 11th outbreak of this virus on November 18th, 2020. Now, this is a very big global health win because of just the nature of the Ebola virus itself. The success of this ending of this 11th outbreak was tied to enhanced track and trace, which we see with COVID, with the testing and tracing and tracking each person on their contacts. and a very, very in-depth enhanced vaccination strategy. I hope that gives you a good historical view on how far we've come using vaccines and global health. So what about the actual medical side of what's going on, or the cellular level? Well, when you encounter a new virus or an existing virus in our repertoire, such as measles or chickenpox, or even the flu, our body knows how to react. And this is because it's encountered these viruses or pathogens before, right? I'm sure I myself, I had chickenpox when I was a child, so I've encountered that virus before. I haven't had measles, but I've been vaccinated against it. And of course, I've had the seasonal flu. Now, what my body does is it creates these antibodies. And you can see these are very specific to each pathogen itself. Now, it uses what's known as an antigen. Now, that antigen is a little spike on top of each virus, right? Now, when a new pathogen like COVID-19 comes along, we can't recognize it. We don't have what's known as a memory towards it. So we cannot create these antibodies against it. And that's where a vaccine comes in. A vaccine essentially allows us to inject ourselves or give our body a small, tiny, non-dangerous fragment of the organism or the antigen. And I'll explain what that means for COVID in the upcoming slides, into our body so that we can recognize these and create what's known as antibodies. So this is a bit of immunology for you. And I think it's very important to understand what's going on in the background of our bodies before we begin to understand what's in the vaccine itself, right? Once we have this memory, right, these antibodies are circling in our body once we give ourselves a vaccine. And if we encounter the real antigen, so if we encounter the real COVID-19 virus in this case, we know how to react. These antibodies come in. It starts off a whole immunological cascade in our body that allows us to fight against it, right? It allows us to mount an immune response and hopefully defeat the virus. Now, why vaccinate ourselves? What's the point? We can either get naturally infected and let it run its course, but this term is called herd immunity. Now, it's been thrown around a lot alongside this whole, this year, and we've heard this term around. But what does it actually mean? Herd immunity is reached when so many people in a population or a community become immune to a disease that it stops the disease from spreading. Now, this could be through natural infection, which is where we heard this term a lot throughout this year, or it could be through vaccination, which is where the success is tied to it. Now, doing so breaks the chain of transmission and protects those who cannot be vaccinated, because unfortunately, there's people amongst us in our population who either are very young infants, are pregnant, or are immunocompromised, or have other diseases that do not allow them to be vaccinated. And this vaccine, if I personally get vaccinated, I'm stopping that chain of transmission to other people. And you can see that in this graphic. This gentleman in yellow is protected by the herd because there's no chain of transmission. And you can see these yellow spots are getting infected. But once 100% of the people are vaccinated, there's no chain. This person cannot infect that person. And in turn, Mr. Yellow T-shirt gentleman is protected from the herd. So historically, we've seen great success in vaccinations as well. Now, it's a very dense graphic, so I'll try and break it down for you. On the left-hand side, we have the states of the United States of America. And what these yellow and red spots are case numbers of measles in the United States across time. Now, these are per 100,000 in the population. And you can see that at this point in about 1965, I believe, the vaccine was introduced in that population. Post that, up to 2010, there still are pockets of measles here and there, but you can see the dramatic effect of introducing a vaccine to protect this population. Now, I am aware that post this graph only runs until 2010, and we are in 2020 right now. So there has admittedly been pockets of measles popping up, and that has been linked to a rise in anti-vaccination campaigns. But as a principle, vaccines work, and they're there to help us. It's using a natural way or to help our bodies get adjusted to these pathogens. Now, there are seasonal influenza vaccines that the NHS kind of wills us to take because it helps protect against the actual influenza virus. When you're a young child, you're told to take the MMR vaccine, and that helps your Your children develop immunity towards all these other infectious diseases that haven't been around for a very long time. And it protects against them in case there are pockets of uprising in the world. So on to the actual vaccines. Now, a lot of has been said about how quick this vaccine has been put into the public. Admittedly, it only has been 11 months since the actual genetic sequence was developed all the way to where we are now. That's an incredible feat in science. It is quick. However, a lot of basic virus discovery is done in the preclinical phase. That can take up to 5 to 10 years, right? Usually for other types of vaccines or even other medications in the pharmaceutical industry. However, in COVID-19's case, we actually had a head start on this. This whole process in the preclinical and discovery phase was accelerated because in 2003, we'd encountered the first SARS. And using our knowledge for that, vaccines were actually begun to be developed, but that outbreak ran out, so that was stopped. But we still had that knowledge there. Also, we had the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome come in, as well as we managed to sequence this SARS coronavirus very, very quickly. So that gave us a massive head start on the preclinical phase. Now, phase 1, 2, and 3 for all the studies that I will mention, and I'll give you some data to back this up, but these were followed in the right way. And they usually, up to phase 3, specifically for the Pfizer vaccine, they encountered about 43,000 people. And that's normal for a phase 3 study. After phase 3, usually it goes down to the FDA, or in the UK, it's the mHRA review. And this is a regulatory and safety body. So in the case of the Pfizer vaccine, this has been approved. But it's worth knowing that this safety data continues to filter in. The Pfizer trial is not stopped. It will continue for about 2 years' time, where there's more safety data going to come in, and we can follow up these patients who are in that trial on for longer. Now, usually what happens after approval, and the company is supposed to collect safety data, and the FDA or MHRA, or the regulatory body within the nation, reviews this evidence consistently to make sure that this vaccine is safe for the population. Now, this is a similar diagram for all medications and medical devices as well, with different timescales. But I just thought I'd give you an overview of how, yes, although this process has been very quick, but no things have been rushed through, and every checkpoint has been followed to its core. So onto the actual vaccines. How do they compare? Well, there's 3 main frontrunners. There's the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine, there's the Moderna vaccine, and then there's the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. The Oxford University AstraZeneca is still under review, and we hope that it will attain regulatory approval in late 2020. It works using a viral vector. It's a 2-dose vaccine, and it's about 60 to 90% effective. The benefit of this one is it can stay at regular fridge temperature, and it's at a very low cost. I'm going to spend most of the time on this presentation on the Pfizer vaccine because it has been approved, and I think that's the one that's been rolled out across the UK. Now, it uses what's known as RNA technology, and I'll explain that in just a moment. But it's also, both of these use the same technology, the Moderna and the Pfizer, and these are also 2-dose vaccines, and they're found up to 95% effectiveness. Now, the main question mark about these is the storage conditions. It has to be stored up to minus 70 degrees because of this RNA technology. So that poses an issue. However, we managed to circumvent this using cold chain storage as well as transport as well. This was approved on the 2nd of December and is currently being rolled out in the UK. I've linked the actual papers here, and I'll discuss the Pfizer one in a bit more detail to give you some more information. I'll brush through this quickly, but just to show you that there's different technologies that these vaccines use. I intend to create some more content in detail for those that are interested. So please keep an eye on my social channels, and hopefully that should make you more aware. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll focus on this mRNA vaccine. And essentially, I'll show you what this mRNA is and why it's so novel and what that means for the actual vaccine that's being injected inside us. So what is mRNA? You know, it's something that's not very well known. We know this molecule, I'm sure, the DNA. We've seen this everywhere. We know this exists inside ourselves, but what is this mRNA? Now, to explain that to you, I have to take a step back. DNA is the central software of life, right? It makes up all of our cells and it gives us the code to be able to compute and do the things we need to do in life. But in order to replicate this DNA has to go through a process, right? Now notice how there's two strands on this DNA. mRNA is actually a broken down version of the DNA with some modifications on top. Notice how there's only one single strand on it, right? And if you remember from basic biology, these little spikes are the different codons. They're A, C, T, and G. That's in DNA. In mRNA, it's A, C, G, and U. So it's different to DNA. Now, what happens in the central dogma of life is the DNA is broken apart when it's to be replicated, and this mRNA is created. From this mRNA, we get proteins. Now, proteins are the building blocks of life, right? This process is essential for how your body creates different proteins in your body. And these amino acids, you sometimes can find them in different supplements. Those aren't created in the body. For those which are, this is the process it follows. So what does all of this really complex biology have to do with the vaccine? Well, I'm sure this image is very familiar to all of you by now. This is the coronavirus. The coronavirus has its own RNA, so it's single-stranded within itself. And then on the outside, this is what's known as a spike protein, right? This is what the actual virus uses to infect us. Now, scientists were very smart, and they said, what if we can create this, create a synthetic version of this spike protein to allow our body to create an antibody against it? If you remember from earlier in the presentation, those were the little Y-shaped molecules. So that's where the mRNA comes in. The mRNA, essentially, you can think of it as, let's say, here's a great analogy for all the food lovers out there. Let's say I want to cook a wonderful aromatic biryani, but I don't know how to do it, right? I need a recipe for it. The mRNA is your recipe book, right? It helps your body, yourself, create this biryani, create this vaccine, create this immune response against it. So essentially, it's a software code that is injected in us in this little cell here. And once it is in our body, it gives our body the recipe to encounter or defeat this virus by creating these antibodies. So this is what is the actual COVID-19 Pfizer vaccine is composed of. And the Moderna one is kind of the same. So it's got this little mRNA sequence inside, and it's got this layer of fat. Now, this layer of fat allows the actual vaccine components to be able to get into our body cells. Our body is protected. You know, every cell in our body is protected with a layer. The reason why this layer exists is because it can merge together, and this RNA will enter our body. Now, it's worth noting that this RNA is not infective at all. You know, it's been synthetically made. It's synthetically made to create this spike protein. Now, in doing that, creating this spike protein is what the virus uses to infect us. So if we are able to create this protein, we can tell our body to recognize it when we encounter the actual virus itself. No? So once we get the vaccine, the immune system actually produces these antibodies and what's known as T cells. These T cells are very important in our immune response. Once the patient encounters the coronavirus, these T cells come in, the antibodies recognize it, and the T cells come in and kill off the actual virus itself, essentially giving us protection against the COVID-19 molecule. I hope that wasn't too technical and allowed you to really understand what's a part of these mRNA vaccines. So I'd like to say here that these aren't living things, right? This mRNA in the actual vaccine is not living. It's been genetically modified so that it creates the protein. It's almost like a recipe for our cells to create it. You know, we're not injecting ourselves with a live virus here. That's another type of vaccine. Those are also in development, I have to say. You know, there's one in, I think the Chinese are actually developing one that uses that technology where a live version of the virus is introduced into our body, and that helps create the immune response. So, is it safe? Now, that's a burning question in everyone's mind. I'll talk you through some of the data, and if you're interested, I've quoted the article here, so you can have an in-depth peruse yourself. However, we found it to be 95% effective against COVID-19 infection in persons 16 years of age or older. So what they did was, in order to test this vaccine, they took 43,000 people and they separated them into two groups. One of the groups received the vaccine and one of the groups received what's known as a placebo. So it's probably salt water in just an injection, right? So it mimics the same process where they get injected in their arm. And about 18,000 people were in the vaccinated group and about 18,000 people were in the placebo group. Now, they followed these people over time for about a median of 2 months. And so they gave 2 doses, 1 dose on day 1 and then another dose after 21 days. What they found was, after this period of time, about 2 months, in the placebo group, 162 people went on to attain the COVID-19 infection. However, in the vaccinated group, only 8 people went on to actually attain the virus itself and get infected by COVID-19. That's where this 95% figure comes from. So 95% of the people in the vaccinated group were protected against the COVID-19 virus, and that's where that figure comes from. Admittedly, these people in this trial were only followed up for about 2 years, and they didn't include anyone under the age of 60 in this trial. However, they do intend to, from the information I've been given and I've read. So we have yet to see that. However, this 95% figure is really, really impressive. If we compare it to other vaccines that are common in use, such as the influenza vaccine, it's about 60% effective. And the measles is about 80 to 90, depending on which age group and timing you give it at. So attaining this number quite early on is really impressive. The vaccine is 2 doses, and as mentioned earlier, it's stored at -70 degrees centigrade. However, it is stable for 5 days in the fridge. So I'm sure, as Dr. Vasu mentioned, because he's a GP in a practice, it's usually held in the fridge in different GP practices for when patients are called in to attain their immunizations. In terms of side effects, there were some in the trial, but they were generally mild. The vaccine was quite well tolerated, and no serious safety concerns were reported. Admittedly, in the trial, there were some serious adverse events that occurred. However, these were not linked to the virus itself the vaccine itself, and were the scientists who did the trial postulated that these were due to other aspects. The other side effects included common ones you'd have with other vaccinations. Because your immune system, once you get vaccinated, is being activated, you will feel sick for maybe a day or two. By sick, I just mean general malaise, probably have a headache or a fever, while your body gets adjusted to this. So this was seen in this trial, and it was seen as normal. So who is actually going to get this? So to date, I think the figure I read today was about 140,000 people have received this vaccine. So these mostly have been residents in care homes, frontline workers, and those 80 and over. I watched the video of the older lady who received the first vaccine, and you could see how happy she was receiving it. So she was one of these first people to receive it. So now the government and along with the Department of Health have developed a kind of a flowchart of who can attain this first, or who is given this first to protect them. Now, frontline workers are those who are more likely to transmit the virus. So they're given it first, and they're here. Along with, we want to protect, from the public health standpoint, all those who are 80 plus. So they're also given it first. And then there's a cascade of those who are most at risk. And then I probably fit into this category here, probably at the end. Because fortunately to me, I don't have any underlying conditions, or I'm not in the older age group. But I guess that's just how the government decided to go about it. Now, there's different means and methods, and I'm sure over time, we'll see different governments choose different strategies. But I think this is a very good strategy to work with, because you're actually targeting the most vulnerable in the population, A, and B, those who are transmitting the virus the most in the frontline workers. So what's next? Well, personally, if I was given the choice today, I would opt for having the vaccine. And I say that because I'm looking at the odds of the risk-benefit ratio. I'm comparing the risk of actually attaining the virus naturally, which is still unknown. We're a year into this, but we still don't know what this virus can actually do to us, right? So if I'm looking at the safety profile of the vaccine, I would rather opt for that, where although admittedly it is 2 months of safety data that's come in, but if I can be that confident that it's that protective in 2 months, I would rather have that risk-benefit ratio than attaining the natural infection. Now, I must caution everyone that because this vaccine has been introduced, it doesn't mean that we have to let go of whatever we've been doing for the past year in terms of the physical distancing side, in terms of the mask use, in terms of the hygiene and hand washing techniques, because this is very important to neutralize the virus. The effects in herd immunity that I mentioned earlier, we'll not see that until probably in the summer or late spring at the very earliest. So between now and the main rollout of the vaccine, we have to continue this. And we're heading into the Christmas period and the holiday period right now, where probably a lot of people want to see their families. I think it's very important to have these considerations in mind when you're making these kinds of plans. Looking at the data, looking at the actual vaccination safety data, I think the future is bright. And I caveat that by saying if we actually manage to keep the rate of infection down. Right now, the news is very sensational sometimes, right? But if we maintain these 3 pillars of what we've seen throughout this pandemic, we can do our own bit to help this vaccination rollout be most effective. I've linked some reading material here for anyone who'd like to have an in-depth peruse. It's quite digestible information, and it gives you just some considerations of the actual vaccines that you might want to be aware of when you're considering either taking it or not. With that, I say thank you very much, Asante Sana, and I hope this has been very informational for you. I open the floor to questions, and I'm available at these different social platforms if you'd like to get in touch with me for any further information or further material that I can share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Ali Akbar. I think we're going to do the question and answers after the discussion, but the question and answers are coming in. I think we're going to just skip across to a video just now. I believe there's a video coming. In the meantime, you'll just have to stare at me, staring at my computer, hoping that this video works. Inshallah, hopefully you guys are finding this beneficial. Please do keep your questions coming in, Microsoft Teams, YouTube, whatever method you'd like to use. Okay, so it looks like I'm back live again, which probably means that the video has concluded. So next, it is my utmost pleasure to introduce a close friend, a brother, someone I consider part of my family, but also someone who I hold in very high regard in terms of his Islamic knowledge and just how humble he is as a human being. I'd like to hand over and introduce the resident alim of Stanmore Jamaat, Sheikh Ja'far Ladak.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلي يا ربي على محمد وآله الطاهرين أما بعد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope inshallah with Dr. Abbas's kind introduction, he will also be showing you the slides that we're going to be using. And the idea behind this is that you will also see the ayat and the ahadith that I wish to quote so that it becomes a little bit more absorbable for you and I. Often, when the speaker speaks, it's just a monologue. But actually, if you're reading the ayat and ahadith with me, then inshallah you and I can follow exactly how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides us with certain principles when it comes to this delicate question. So, in the second slide, you'll see that there's going to be 3 areas that I hope to introduce, inshallah. And that is that we're going to mention the theological perspective, which will help us to be able to think about our interaction with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over this period of time, over these last 9-10 months in which we have been experiencing this pandemic. The second area is for us to be able to reflect on what is our personal responsibility when it comes to the types of information that we are being bombarded with. And we will try to address this by bringing to the fore some of the challenges that we have in our community around the circulation of information that is not actually sound. How does the Quran, the Ahadith tell us that we are supposed to react? And what level of responsibility do we have when we either are acquiring information or passing on information to others? And then thirdly, inshallah, we will just give an ishara towards the fiqhi perspective. And much of the medical ethics and medical activities that we engage in are already very well known. And so it's not going to be something groundbreaking, but rather just a return to probably what we already know when it comes to various different medical interventions that we have had to take throughout the courses of our own lives, or maybe those who are our family and friends. So let us begin, inshallah, with the theological perspective. And in that third slide, I've started with an ayah of the Quran in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kind of describes our situation over these last 9 or 10 months. We have been seeking from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relief from this pandemic for all of the obvious reasons, whether it be due to the mental health fatigue that this has caused, the economic challenges that this has caused, or sadly indeed, we have experienced deaths and a great degree of illness that has come from this. All of us have been impacted. And there's no doubt that we have been asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for relief from this. Allah Jalla Jalaluhu tells us in the Quran that there are those who ask for a way out of the challenges that are presented to them, but when He brings them to the safety that they have been begging for, many of those are ungrateful for the door that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has opened for you and I to walk through to be able to escape the challenge that we have been asking safety from. So the verse I mentioned here in Surah Luqman, verse number 32. Now you'll know Surah Luqman alayhi salam is in this surah giving advice to his son. And so the theme of the surah is for us to be able to learn how we need to be able to act in certain given circumstances. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses this issue. He says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَإِذَا غَشِيَهُمْ مَوْجٌ كَالذُّلَلِ دَعَوُا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. For most people, when waves engulf them like shadows, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us an imagery here. And He's saying that, imagine you're on that boat and the waves are crashing against you and the boat is being rocked and you fear capsizing. When the waves engulf them like dark shadows, what do? They call unto Allah sincerely, asking Him alone to deliver them to safety. And you'll know that how many times people, when the airplane, it just kind of moves, what happens with that turbulence? Immediately the sibha comes out, we open up the dua book, oh Allah, grant me safety, I will do this, I'll do that. Here, what happens is the ayah says, فَلَمَّا نَجَّاهُمْ إِلَى الْبَرِّ. When Allah actually brings them safely to the shore, what happens? فَمِنْهُمْ مُقْتَصِدٌ. Some of them, they stop halfway. They go between belief and disbelief. They know that they wanted something from God, it came, but they don't really want to go that little way further of the things that they have committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَجْحَدُ بِآيَاتِنَا إِلَّا كُلُّ خَتَّارٍ كَفُورٍ. Yet none could knowingly reject our messages unless he is really ungrateful. So when we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the end of the pandemic, and it is on the horizon, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala delivers us to the shoreline of that, we have to reflect deeply upon why we then would want to reject that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent to us. We remember that famous story in the books of Ahadith where that person is drowning. He calls out, "Oh Allah, save me." A ship passes by. He says, "No, I'm waiting for Allah to save me." And of course, when he drowns and he meets with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he asks him, "Why didn't you come and save me, Allah? I called out to you." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would respond to him by saying, "But I did send my safety for you. I did send the ship. You were the one who rejected it." So we have to be very clear that if we believe all of this time, the global community has collectively been praying for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us faraj and relief from this, to then reject when that relief comes to us surely makes us an ingrate, or someone who is not grateful for that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent to us. In the next slide, I mentioned a hadith from our 11th Imam, Hassan al-Askari, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, in which the Imam alayhi salam actually tells us that the role of Imam al-Mahdi, ajjalallahu ta'ala faraj al-sharif, is to help preserve all of mankind. His wasila, his presence is such a blessing, but not only for the Shia, not only for the Muslim community, but for the entirety of the world and its population. He is responsible to assist them in delivering them from whatever trials and tribulations are afflicting them. So imagine, you might think of this in terms of war. You might think of this in terms of economic downturn. But surely the whole global community facing this pandemic is a huge bala. Our 11th Imam al-Askari alayhi salam says, "Bihi, through him, by him, are the people of the earth protected from bala. وَبِهِ يُنزِلُ الْغَيْثِ, and through him are the plentiful rains sent. وَبِهِ يُخْرِجُ الْبَرَكَاتِ الْأَرْضِ, and by him do the blessings of the earth emerge." So again, if we understand correctly the role of our 12th Imam alayhi salam, we would realize that the 12th Imam alayhi salam is not only there to protect you and I as believers in him, but actually his role expands to everyone on this planet. And so for us to have been given the opportunity to protect ourselves globally, communally, again, theologically needs to be reflected upon. So here, I will now go to the next slide, inshallah, or Dr. Abbas will go to the next slide for us, and you and I will take opportunity to be able to reflect on the second discussion that we wish to be able to think about. And that is the personal responsibility that we have when it comes to this particular matter. And from this angle, what I hope to be able to reflect on is the great challenge in our national communities, as well as our religious communities, when it comes to the question of our responsibility of having correct knowledge being given to us, and understanding what we share with others and when we share things to ensure that it has come from a credible source. Now, obviously, this particular program has been put on for us because there are so many questions, but also so many conspiracy theories about COVID-19. Some of them we do have to take into account. Some of them are legitimate questions. Some of them are also very, very superstitious, very, very out there. And we've had a systematic attempt to try to misinform people, not only about the pandemic, but generally when it comes to our politics, generally when it comes to the national dialogue. There is a systematic effort to try to make people unaware of what is truth and sound knowledge. We live in what is known as the post-truth society, where in this era, in this age, the most important social currency of truth is no longer valued by people. Imagine how important truth is to a society. Imagine right now if I told you something and you could not believe me, or you doubted everything that came. And imagine then if whatever comes to you from the news or from the government or from the NHS, you doubted, you were skeptical about. How could our societies function properly if we are unable to have a sense of respect and trustworthiness in one another? This is something that is occurring, and this is something that is actually being planned in the society to undermine what is normal knowledge. The Quran speaks about this, and the Quran warns us about this particular matter in a number of different ways. And so I'll just bring a couple of ayat in order to be able to shed some light on this particular matter. The first thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us is that we are prohibited from following people who do not have sufficient knowledge about any matter, whatever that matter is, whether it be in regards to medical or fiqh. If a person is not sufficient with their knowledge, they cannot be trusted as an authority. We are prohibited from taking someone who is going to lead us astray. In this ayah, again in Surah Luqman, where again with the theme of Surah Luqman is good, sound advice, wisdom from father to son. In this particular ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَشْتَرِي لَهْوَ الْحَدِيثِ لِيُذِلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. And from amongst people, there is he who takes frivolous knowledge, lahwa al-hadith, a type of knowledge which has no value to it. They take that, why? لِيُذِلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. So that they lead astray people away from Allah's path without any knowledge. There are people who actively do this. وَيَتَّخِذَهَا هُزُوًا أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. And they take all of this knowledge, proper sound knowledge, for just mockery. They're just playing games with you to try to abuse, to try to cause problems and mischief. For such people, they will have an abasing chastisement. We have to realize that there are some people who take lahwul hadith. Now in the next slide, you will see that there is a second set of verses. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we are obligated to check our sources with expert knowledge. Now you will know that our fuqaha, for example, may Allah preserve them, they perform what is known as istinbat. Istinbat means to deduce knowledge. It is like taking the water from the deepest well or the deepest part of the well and drawing it all the way for someone to be able to take. You will notice in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that actually we are obligated to return matters of public safety to those people capable of doing istinbat, drawing the water of knowledge from the depths of the well. Now, this is a general statement from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When it comes to fuqaha, maraji' al-kiram, we apply this ayah to them. When it comes to expertise, such as the expertise that you just heard earlier on in the really informative, detailed presentation, we are also obligated to take expert knowledge in whichever field it may be in. Have a look at this particular ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when it comes to some individuals at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, regarding a matter of public safety or fear. And this is important, isn't it? Because we are talking about public safety at the moment, right? And it's couched in medical language, herd immunity, right? We want to get as many people protected as possible. وَإِذَا جَاءَهُمْ أَمْرٌ مِنَ الْأَمَنِ. Aman, safety, security. When there comes to them a matter regarding aman, there are some people who don't understand what their responsibilities are. They just divulge, they talk about it like lahu al-hadith without checking what can be said, what can't be said. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, if those people had only referred the matter to the messenger, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, وَلَوْ رَدُّوهُ إِلَى الرَّسُولِ وَإِلَى أُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْهُمْ, and those who are vested with authority from amongst the community, لَعَلِمَهُ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَنْبِطُونَهُ مِنْهُمْ, the proper investigators would have checked, would have tested the issue for them, and then you would have known what is correct and what is not correct. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that this structure of having the Prophet, having ulil amr, having alladhina yastanbitunahu minhum, those who are capable of deriving proper knowledge from matters, this is a rahmah for you. This is a fadl for you. Were it not for the fadl of Allah and the mercy of Allah unto you, all but a few of you would have fallen into the clutches of shaitan. A very important ayah. Think about how this ayah applies to you and I at this time. In the next slide, you will see here, now, the third responsibility of personal responsibility is that not everyone who sends you something is being truthful or is necessarily aware of what they are sending you. And the comment I made earlier is that we're living in a time of what is known as a post-truth society. And this has been created for you and I to not know the truth about certain matters, whatever it may be. You'll remember that Michael Gove, a politician, a member of the cabinet, when it came, for example, to Brexit, it always comes down to Brexit, right? He said, why should we trust the experts? What you can see is there is an attempt to undermine proper knowledge. And as a result, the space has been left for all sorts of bombardment on Facebook, on social media, on WhatsApp messages, about all sorts of nonsense that is being circulated, about Bill Gates and downloading chips into brains so that they can control us through these vaccines. There are legitimate questions, but then we also have to realize that there are some questions which are nonsensical and that we don't have to validate. We don't have to answer. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us this in the Quran, that sometimes a mischief maker, an unaware person sends you something, tells you something, and we then forward it on unwittingly without realizing the damage that we have done. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu in ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyanu. When an iniquitous person comes to you with a tale, look into it. Use your judgment, discern, lest you hurt people unwittingly and afterwards we become filled with remorse for us having passed on the wrong sorts of information. I reiterate, the knowledge that is circulated in WhatsApp is not the equivalent of the knowledge of a senior medical practitioner, an epidemiologist, a virologist. And so the fact that we've been given tawfiq by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ask our questions to expert knowledge, we should take this as a blessing and make sure that we utilize this opportunity tonight. The last section I wish to be able to mention is the fiqh perspective. And as I said, I'm not here to reinvent the wheel. I imagine you are all very comfortable with understanding that when a medical intervention presents itself, there are times when it becomes obligatory for us to take that, and there are times when it becomes recommended for us to be able to take that. Now, Dr. Abbas Tajani will tell you about when there might be those types of challenges that help us to review when a medical intervention is useful to us, whether it's going to cause us more problems, or when it is the right thing to take, and your own doctors will give you that information about you personally, inshallah. But we all know that the fiqh provides us with some sort of framework from which to work from. We know that we are obligated to protect and save our own lives. Therefore, when we know that there is, depending on which location we are in, up to a 2% death rate, we know that we have to protect and save our own lives. It immediately sheds light on our responsibility towards having those medical interventions. We also know that we are obligated to save life where possible. And we know that if I am to transmit this disease to someone else, there is a chance that either I could harm them significantly, or God forbid, I would kill them by passing this on. And you've all seen the guidance from His Eminence Ayatollah As-Sistani, may Allah protect him and grant him a long life, that if we were to knowingly or even unknowingly pass this on to someone, we would be responsible before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, if having this vaccine is able to ensure that we cannot pass this on, and that's something that the medical expertise will clarify, and it again sheds light upon the obligations that are in front of us. We also know that we are obligated to reduce harm wherever possible. The hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi says, La dharar wa la dhirar. Islam does not allow us to harm others, and it does not allow harm to come to us. And so in our attempt to be able to reach herd immunity, to be able to protect people, we have to reduce harm wherever possible. And if that means taking on medical interventions, which reduces the potential of us harming others, then we need to be able to do so. In the next slide, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that we must protect ourselves and our family members. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum. From what? Nara, from the hellfire. But we are still obligated to protect ourselves and our family members. And in the last slide, we know that if we can save a life, such as protecting them from harm and not passing on this disease, then we know that we must do so. Now, it's important for us to be able to remember that it's not only about death. We know that there is significant harm done to people who contract coronavirus. Up to a fifth of people still have coronavirus symptoms 5 weeks after being infected, with half of them continuing to experience problems for up to 12 weeks. Some of the latest data shows. And therefore we realize that even by passing this on to someone else, long-term, lifelong damage can sadly be passed on. If you and I are able to protect ourselves and able to protect others, there is a very strong argument to tell us that there is an obligation for us, if not in the least, for us to be recommended in taking those interventions. I hope this presentation has been useful for you. As we stated, there were 3 areas of discussion: the theological, our personal responsibility when it comes to information, and thirdly, the fiqhi, which tells us between the obligation and the recommendations for us to be able to take these interventions. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salli ya Rabbi ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.
Ahsan, Sheikh. I think we're just going to a quick video now, just to remind you to fill out a webinar form. Okay, so thank you very much. So next I'm going to be just giving a presentation, and I know that we've had lots and lots of questions come in, so inshallah, hopefully a lot of what I'm going to be presenting will be in answer to a lot of the questions that have come through. So inshallah, I think from my point of view, one of the first things I want to start off by doing is sorting the fact from the fiction. So where are we at this moment in time? So we know that on the 4th of December, NHS England sent a message out to GP surgeries nationwide to give them a 10-day warning that we're going to be rolling out the vaccine from the 14th of December. We know that the UK government has purchased 350 million vaccinations to vaccinate the public. And we know that there's been lots and lots of skepticism, particularly from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, to include people from the Far East as well. One of the first things I wanted to start talking about is our psyche seems to be so deeply ingrained to believe everything must be a conspiracy theory. This must be something from the Zionists, or must be from the West, or there's some sort of conspiracy behind this. Nothing can be purely what scientists and leading experts around the world claim it is. And there are lots and lots of investigations underway looking into this, and early indications suggest that this has been a targeted campaign on social media platforms against Black, Asian, and minority ethnics, as well as Muslims, to not have the vaccine. And those of you that have watched documentaries like The Greatest Hack will know about things like this, such as the Cambridge Analytica scandal that went on during the Trinidad and Tobago elections with the Do So movement, the American elections with Trump's election win, how people in Britain were manipulated into voting for Brexit. So those of you that have watched The Greatest Hack will know exactly what I'm talking about. But early indications looking into this has suggested that particularly people that have been sitting on the fence or have been looking into conspiracy theories on social media have had specific targeted advertising and targeted posts towards them to try to convince them that this whole coronavirus business, that the vaccine is all a hoax, there's some sort of conspiracy theory behind it. And me as a GP, having seen hundreds of patients getting coronavirus, thousands of my patients getting coronavirus, and hundreds of them dying, this is a very, very real disease. One of the commonest theories that's being bandied around is that Bill Gates wants to put microchips inside you. And this was actually something that was created by the Russian Communist Party. This was the first place where this information came from, back in May, by the Russian Communist Party, when Bill Gates gave an interview talking about digital certificates. And at the time, there was a lot of discord between the Communist and the Capitalist Party in Russia. There's no truth in this, you know. In fact, if you're worried about microchips, I want you to consider this. You all have mobile phones, you all have laptops, you all have computers. They track your movements 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Something on your phone or on your mobile tells you how long you sleep for, how deep you sleep for. It tracks your movement within inches when you're browsing in the supermarkets. It tells you exactly what you're buying on Amazon and online. There's no truth in this. And if the owner of Microsoft wanted to track you with microchips, he's got much better means to his hands with the technology that he works with to track you. Another thing about this will change your DNA. Something I've read, the new vaccine for COVID-19 will literally alter your DNA. It will wrap itself into your system. You'll essentially become a genetically modified human being. And this, again, is incorrect. And as we've heard from Brother Ali Akbar, and I'll emphasize this again, this vaccine is an mRNA vaccine, and it contains the virus's genetic code. What this does is it instructs cells to produce what we call an antigen, a spike protein to coronavirus, which is then detected by your body's immune cells as this is something that doesn't belong here, and the immune cells mount a response to destroy it. And that trains your immune system in the same way that you would train yourself for a marathon. It trains your immune system to do that when it's exposed to the live virus. It does not change your DNA. There's another thing about, for example, that this vaccine uses cells from aborted fetuses, and this is in reference to the Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine. And again, this is not true. Confusion arose because there's a step in producing vaccines, which is true of every vaccine that has been produced since the 1960s. And all your vaccinations for your travels abroad to Tanzania or wherever we're going with the yellow fever vaccinations or childhood immunizations, tetanus immunizations, where clone cells, not embryo cells, are used to work like a factory to manufacture the vaccine. The vaccine is then purified and all the cellular material, the material that comes from the cells, is removed and not used in the vaccines. And this is something that's been pre-existing since the 1960s. There's also this theory that actually your chance of dying from COVID is very, very slim. Actually, we know that the mortality rate at the moment is climbing above 1% and heading towards 2%, which means that out of every 100 people who catch COVID, 1 person will die. But we also know that that's not just the end of the matter. We know that a fifth, up to a fifth, 20 people out of 100, that means 1 person in 5 people who contract coronavirus, will be subjected to what we call long COVID syndrome, a condition where their breathing significantly diminishes, their energy levels diminish, they require intensive rehabilitation to return back to normal. And I've seen so many patients. In fact, I've referred at least 5 patients today of my own in my clinic earlier today who were suffering with long COVID syndrome. You are 425 times more likely to have an adverse effect from COVID than to have an adverse effect from the vaccine. There's a 1 in a million chance of dying, there's a 1 in a million chance of having a severe allergic reaction from the vaccine. There's 1 in a million chance of having a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine. You'll have seen this, and there were 2 cases recently. And to put this in perspective, you are 6 times more likely to die just getting out of your bed. You're 10 times more likely to die from a general anesthetic, and we know that there are hundreds of thousands of operations that happen every single day in the country. And you're actually 12 times more likely to die from swimming, even if you're this guy, Ian Thorpe. There's no truth in that whatsoever. One of the other things I wanted to cover, and this will be one of the last myths I cover, and then I'll cover a few more in the Q&A if time allows. But there's this thing about the coronavirus vaccine has been rushed. And again, this is incorrect. I mean, coronavirus is a virus that's been under research since 2012 when we had SARS and then MERS. And in terms of the coronavirus family, it is one of the most stable respiratory viruses. So there's very little room for mutations or other variants to form. Okay, so there's very little chance that this will mutate into something that we don't understand. The coronavirus family is very small and is very well understood. So there's research that has gone into this over the last 8 years. There have been dedicated research think tanks that have existed for the last 8 years, whose job day in, day out for the last 8 years has been to study coronavirus before all of this hit. Usually any vaccine or drug that's produced has a number of obstacles it faces before it comes out to market. We know that funding is needed to start a research trial. We know that phase 1 trials are undertaken, papers are written and submitted, they wait months for the papers to be published before they get funding for the next phase to start. They then start recruiting participants into a trial, which again takes a long time. And then the cycle repeats itself. Each time the paper that they're publishing, the study that they're publishing is getting longer and longer and longer, which means the time it takes for people who are reviewing the paper, it takes them longer to do that. The funding that's needed for the next phase of the trial is even more, so it takes longer to get all of the money together for the trial, and each phase gets longer and longer and longer. With COVID being number one on the agenda because of the conditions in which we live, the fact that it's so widespread, all the obstacles of funding and bureaucracy have been eliminated. Thousands of volunteers have volunteered to partake in the trials. And the quicker a disease spreads, we know the quicker the results are obtained for a trial. And so the quicker we know if a drug or vaccine is effective or not. So actually, when you take away all those obstacles, the due processes that have been followed for this vaccine, from start to finish, from funding to doing the research, if you take away all the bureaucracy, all the problems, all the obstacles, all due process has been followed. And this vaccine, the production of this vaccine, has followed all the processes we'd normally want to see in a vaccine or drug. Now, someone asked a question about ingredients. So just to run through the ingredients of the Pfizer vaccine, we know that it contains the mRNA, and we've talked about this. It contains lipids, which are fat molecules inside the vaccine. It contains potassium chloride, which is what you get in, for example, the low salt type of salt that you use. Also contains something called monobasic potassium phosphate. Just to give you an example, it's contained in frozen ready meals, in tinned tuna, in baked goods like croissants, in dairy products, in cereals, in tofu, in any of your condiments that you use like ketchup and mayonnaise and so forth. Sodium chloride, which is, again, your table salt, and then sucrose, which is a type of sugar, and something called dibasic sodium phosphate dehydrate, which is contained in macaroni, in pasta, and in cheese. As a summary, what I want to just summarize and just highlight to everyone, do not take WhatsApp videos and social media posts at face value. There was a research study that was done a year ago, and where they asked people who use WhatsApp regularly, how often do you actually read or watch a video before you forward it on to other people? And only 5% of people partaking in that study actually said that they actually read or watch the full video or read the full article before they forward it on to someone else. And this is how misinformation spreads. The vaccine is thoroughly grounded in science. We've got people who are world-leading experts in this all backing the vaccine. There are also lots of myths out there. And so our responsibility, our job, our aim with this particular discussion is to try to bring light to what the vaccine is and to debunk some of the myths that are out there, because they will put you in the wrong place. And we don't want that for our community. We want to be people who are shining examples, because ultimately, when you look at coronavirus, you look at COVID-19, we, from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic population, have the worst outcomes when it comes to coronavirus. If there's anyone who's likely to get a complication from coronavirus, you can bet it's going to be us, the Asian population. So that's all I wanted to say on that. And what I want to do now is to open this out to a Q&A. So inshallah, we've got Brother Ali Akbar, we've got Sheikh Ja'far. So we've had quite a few questions that have come in. So I know I've said quite a few bits and pieces, so I'll answer a few questions a bit later down the line if needed. Vaccine stopping the chain of infection. Has this been shown in clinical trials? Brother Ali Akbar.
So, admittedly, the Pfizer trial that happened did not show a break in transmission. So that was one of the fallbacks of this particular study, right? It did, however, show great protection for individuals, and that's why it's being touted, and that's why it's being spread out. So on an individual level, it's shown amazing potential for safe efficacy and safety as well, and protection against the virus. Now, I understand from the reading I've done and research that's been going on that there will be transmission blocking studies ongoing, so that, for example, if I have the vaccine, am I actually able to transmit the virus if I get it? So those kinds of studies have yet to be done. However, be assured that they will be done, right? But from the data we have currently, it's mostly personal protection as opposed to a population. Now, I know that this combats the information I've given of herd immunity, but I would like to caveat that information by saying herd immunity is something that we expect later on, once sufficient amount of the population has been vaccinated. But that's important to reach because it protects those who cannot be, right? So herd immunity is for later. However, personal protection begins with you as an individual and then onto the population.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Can a vaccinated person pass on the virus to an unvaccinated person?
This is a difficult one to answer because I'm not an immunologist. However, theoretically, from the science perspective, if you have a neutralizing antibody from a vaccine, it comes in. Once you get COVID, the actual virus will be killed inside you, will be attenuated. So theoretically, you should not be able to pass the virus on to someone else, right? Practically speaking, I think we'd have to do several studies, and that relates to the kind of the transmission blocking study I just mentioned. So I think it's yet to be seen. However, from what we've seen in the science aspect, I'd err on the side of saying my theory would be no, but I think we'd need a lot more evidence to back that up.
Absolutely. Jazakallah khair. There's a question that I want to answer here, which is a pretty long one. It's got the most likes. I want to just deal with this bit by bit. So it says, none of the trials currently underway are designed to detect a reduction in any serious outcomes such as hospital admissions, intensive care, or death. That sentence just there is actually incorrect. It's one of the known endpoints for any trial that if there is a serious adverse outcome, such as a hospital admission, intensive care, or death, the trial is stopped. Okay, so that sentence is incorrect. No other vaccines being studied to determine whether they can interrupt the transmission of the virus. That's part and parcel of the next stage of the vaccine trials, and Brother Lepa has already dealt with that. Was there an independent assessment of industry-sponsored research included in policy development because of big corporate giants using their own interests as a result? And that's why, to answer that point, that's why we have the MHRA and the JCVI. The JCVI being the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunizations, and MHRA being those that standardize the vaccines and drugs that are currently in circulation. And they have robust, independent scientists who look at making those judgments independent of any form of influence from big pharma or anything like that. You have to bear in mind, this is not countries such as America, where pharmaceuticals is so deeply ingrained in the medical healthcare system. Within the UK, our licensing, our authorization for medicines and vaccines is a completely separate, detached process from pharmaceutical giants. So we can completely rest assured that separate strategization and triaging has taken place of these vaccinations. Sheikh, are we in a position to give an Islamic opinion? Have we consulted His Eminence with our findings about the virus for him to give his opinion on this issue?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I have reached out to offices from both Najaf and Qom as well as Karbala of the Maraja. We have had some offices comment, and we have had other offices not yet comment. And I think the reason as to why we are not seeing comment yet is because I think two reasons have been given to me. The first is that in places like Iran and Iraq, the vaccine has not reached there yet. Obviously, in terms of Iraq, I think they're going to be doing a lot more import. And as you know, that they have not been able to import the vaccine as of yet. In terms of Iran producing its own, as far as yesterday, they have not yet produced their own vaccine, which means that there's not been any comment or encouragement or dissuasion or anything like that from the officers of the Maraja. However, we have had, for example, some leading scholars from the offices give their statements. And for example, one did say, Tawakkul ala Allah, please go ahead, trust in Allah. This is like any other medical intervention. And I also sent you a voice clip today that there are some scholars, not Maraji', but senior scholars, who they themselves have also considered some of the conspiracy theories and are worried about the conspiracy theories. We say that because that will come out. That's normal. That will be passed out. And there's no need for us to be able to hide that. I think what we do need to do is we need to refer ourselves back to the medical expertise here. The Maraji', may Allah bless them, will themselves take the guidance from the medical expertise. And I think the more that the Shia medical expertise can provide the offices of the Maraji' with the latest information, they will be in a better position, a better informed position to be able to reflect on that material. So I think people like yourself, Ali Akbar and Abbas, you know, when you're able to provide the wukala locally, as well as the offices in Najaf and Qom and Karbala with this information, we will have a much better response from the Maraji', and I imagine that to come in the coming weeks.
Brilliant. So there's another question here about if the vaccine was so safe, why do pharmaceutical companies have legal immunity, why they're protected from vaccine injury claims. In the end, the government will have to pay, meaning taxpayers' money and all the rest of it. Now, this is something that was highlighted very recently, but actually, I don't know if viewers at home know this, but this has actually been in place since 1986. So this is nothing new. This was when there was skepticism around the diphtheria, tetanus, polio, and pertussis vaccination, which was developed, and there was a real drive to get patients to have this vaccination, for children to have this vaccination. And we know since then it has been an integral part of the childhood immunization program in this country and across the developed world. And so it started in 1986. It's nothing new. This is nothing that is part of a big conspiracy. This has been going on for the best part of 34 years, heading into 35 years. I don't know, Brother Ali, but if you want to add anything more to that.
Yeah, I mean, I just echo what you said. It's not something new, and a lot of things are in place for this to be since, as you said, the 1980s. So that's all I'll add on that.
Brilliant. There's a question here: when the Oxford vaccine comes out, will we have a choice? Now, a lot of that actually depends on the type of vaccination amounts that we have in this country, whether you'll get the Oxford vaccine or the Pfizer or the Moderna. As I said, the government have bought 350 million vaccines, enough to vaccinate the population 6 times over. So a lot of it will depend on what vaccines we have in the country at this particular time. We are starting our own, personally for my patients, we are starting our vaccination program on Sunday. I myself will be vaccinated on Sunday, inshallah, along with my patients, and we'll be given the Pfizer vaccine. We were initially expecting the AstraZeneca one, but there's been delays, so we'll be getting the Pfizer one. Either way, it makes little difference to me because, inshallah, I'm going to be getting the vaccine on Sunday. Brother Ali Akbar, in terms of previous mRNA vaccines, so for example, the Ebola vaccine, is there any safety data from that and side effect data from the Ebola vaccine or other mRNA technologies that are currently out there?
So I'd like to make a distinction. The Ebola vaccine does not use mRNA technology, but
okay.
I mean, in vaccinations, this is the first time it's actually being used in a vaccine specifically. However, I caveat that by saying mRNA technology or the use of mRNA technology for medical and therapeutic purposes, the theories have been out since 2005 at the very earliest stage. So it's been around for a long time. However, this is the first time where we've been able to accelerate that knowledge and the actual research into a practical use. Now, a lot of you may have heard the husband and wife pair who actually are the CEOs of BioNTech for the Pfizer vaccine. They actually have been researching the use of mRNA in cancer, right? So that is another big use. And I'm sure you can go onto the website and you see all of their data they've been collecting, right? Specifically for vaccine trials, I'm not sure. However, if there's a high demand for this, I can do some research and put some content out there that would help alleviate this burning question. I'd like to mention one thing that may have come up in your talk, Dr. Abbas. You mentioned the new strain that's going around, and whether that would impact kind of the vaccination campaign. On the genetic side, actually, this new strain seems to be more effective. However, this vaccine targets different places on that spike protein, so that mRNA targets different aspects of that spike protein. Along with that fact, as well as the fact that the vaccine actually elicits a great immune response quite early on, greater than natural infection, I think at this stage we shouldn't be too worried about the new strain going around and how that will affect vaccines. However, it is important to see what happens to the new variant. You mentioned the coronaviruses can mutate. This is a natural process. This happens over time. I think a good analogy is to say, if you're writing a whole page of notes, how many errors are you going to make when you go from top to bottom? Think of how many times that virus is copied. It will naturally make a mistake, right? Mutations are common, but it's less common because this specific coronavirus has its own kind of proofreading mechanisms that it uses, right? So to dispel any kind of myths out there that this new strain or this mutation can cause more harm than good, yes, and it deserves to be researched. And the current strain that's out there, and I know there's one in London, is being highly researched to see what the actual effects are. But be rest assured that currently, to our knowledge, this vaccine will not be affected by it, but more ongoing research is going on.
Brilliant. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much. There's a question here about, I've just lost it. Why are we being offered a vaccine when the illness is treatable with normal medical methods? And Brother Leopard, I don't know if you want to say something on this, and then inshallah I'll also give a comment on this as well.
So what we know about viruses is naturally we can eliminate them, right? There are antiviral medications that we can take, but that is after the fact or pre-exposure, and that's very hard to reach a patient in that stage. And as well, for this particular coronavirus, we're having to repurpose antiviral medications. There's no specific medication to say, let's take A, B, and C, and it will protect, or it will say you will be protected against COVID. No, there doesn't exist that just yet. Now, when a patient's hospitalized, I'm sure Dr. Abbas knows that some people can actually get intubated, and we want to avoid that entirely, right? That's why we say we want to protect ourselves against getting the virus initially anyway, right? A lot of people think that the younger generation, probably someone my age will probably get it, and then I'll be fine after. Yeah, it might be, but that's not the point. I think the point is that I may also be severely sick, and we want to avoid that entirely, and that's why we're vaccinated against people. I'm sure you have some points to add.
Yes.
From us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just to follow on and echo what you said. So why are we being offered a vaccine when this illness is treatable with normal medical methods? So this is where we boil down to the two different arms of medicine. Something where we practice preventative medicine and medicine to limit the effect of a disease once you have it. So for example, you know that there is something that will cause a particular harm to happen to your body. So you go about avoiding that harm from coming to the body. Is COVID treatable with normal medical methods? Not really. We can just about preserve life. We can't control the long-term consequences of what COVID will have. 1 in 5 people will go on to develop serious complications from COVID-19, scarring of the lungs called fibrosis, scarring of a multitude of various different vital organs within your body, pericarditis, which is a buildup of fluid, infected fluid around the heart, which affects how the heart functions. And over time, that fluid can lead to scarring and a restriction in the way that the heart muscle moves. And over time could lead to something called heart failure, which is where the efficiency of the heart is irreversibly affected. Okay, so actually, is this illness something that can be treated with normal medical methods? Actually, no. There is no cure for coronavirus apart from allowing time and allowing nature to take its course. And whether you're part of that unlucky 1 in 5 that will go on to develop long-term outcomes from COVID-19 remains to be seen, versus the 4 in 5 who don't. Now, if we have a vaccination that can prevent any of that heartache from happening, why not take it up? Why not take up something that we know if any serious adverse events were going to happen, we would see them within the first 2 months of a vaccination? That's accepted in vaccination sciences and vaccination studies. Yes, we don't have any information of what happens, 1 year, 2 year, 10 years down the line, but we know that actually the type of vaccinations that we're dealing with, there's a very good understanding of the science involved. And we know that if there were any long-term outcomes or long-term adverse effects as part of the outcomes, we would know within a couple of months. All right. Does the vaccine permanently change your genetic makeup? Are we tampering with Allah's creation, Sheikh?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You already mentioned that it doesn't change our genetic makeup. Can you just?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And so there would be no reason for it to be prohibited from the perspective of the question that's being asked. Even if we were to tamper with our genetic makeup, this in and of itself is not considered to be prohibited, because it's not necessarily negative. It's not necessarily going to do any harm. And there have been marajah that have written on this in depth. For example, His Eminence, Marhum Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussein al-Shirazi, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, has written a book on cloning. And it's available in English. You can just Google this book, it is available. And in there, he was asked this question, that if we are doing cloning and we are changing genetic makeup, is this not prohibited because we are changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And he stated that in and of itself, it is a neutral act. Only when we change the creation of Allah, which defaces it or takes away the hurmah of something, at that point, it becomes negative to change the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Otherwise, we do that all the time. We dig into the mountains. We dig into the earth to be able to take out minerals. We're constantly changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as long as it's done for protection or benefit of humankind, it is permissible.
Okay. Thank you very much. Brother Ali Akbar, what about the vaccination? Will that cure coronavirus? Are we looking at this turning into a seasonal vaccination, which we'll need to have as part of our seasonal vaccinations like pneumococcal injections and flu vaccinations?
So there's differing thought on this in all the scientists out there. I'm on the camp that we may have to have seasonal vaccinations, just like the flu, but they may not be as frequent, right? I just mentioned that how quickly the coronavirus mutates is a lot slower than other viruses out there. And the reason for that is because embedded within its own genetic makeup, the coronavirus has these proofreading mechanisms. So if it makes a mistake in its code, it can correct itself, right? Any new vaccinations that come on will be a result of any mutations that come along, right? So based on that fact, I do suspect there will be kind of a shift in what happens to the pathogen itself. Now, for example, if you take, let's say 50% of the population are vaccinated, you can think of this the virus as you can think of it in it wants to live, it wants to survive, right? So it will naturally shift its own genetic makeup to be able to infect those who have been vaccinated, right? That's a natural process in nature. It happens with all kinds of different pathogens out there. You know, the flu is one of them, HIV is another, right? So I do suspect, my personal opinion, this may happen with the coronavirus, but we have the tools at hand and to combat this, right? If we're able to sequence the genetic makeup in a matter of a month and create one whole vaccine, right, in a matter of 11 months, then I'm very confident we'll able to, in the future, combat any seasonal variations in the virus itself.
There's a question here about, Pfizer's track record and things like that. And that's something I want to address, actually, because there's lots and lots of conspiracy theories around the fact that the person who owns Pfizer may be of a particular background that people take issue with, or, for example, that the drugs they produce have created issues. But actually, when you look at the day-to-day drugs that I use in general practice for my patients, the vast majority have been made by Pfizer. We look at things like atorvastatin, probably one of the most useful drugs. Statins are extremely useful at reducing your risk of long-term outcomes from heart attacks and strokes. If it was up to me, I'd add statins to the drinking water that we have in the UK. That's how effective I think they are. There's antidepressant medication like sertraline. We've got antibiotics that are all made by Pfizer. There are so many fantastic medications made by Pfizer. Yes, they make money by selling drugs, but that's the same with anything. People, an ice cream seller makes money by selling ice creams. Does that mean he's putting, things inside your ice cream to make it addictive to you? No. So one of the things we need to be mindful of is people who have certain conspiracy theories will take issues against certain things within a particular company, and they will then create a misdirected or misinformed or misinterpreted conclusion to a particular set of circumstances. There's a question here that there's an obs and gynae specialist who now practices holistic medicine, saying all these vaccines are conspiracy theories. Now, if I was someone who practiced holistic medicine and I wanted to drive up my own clientele, my advice to them would be, don't follow traditional medicine, come to my holistic medicine clinic and I will treat you with things that don't involve traditional medicine. You have to put things into context and look at two sides of the argument. What I'm trying to present here is that there needs to be balance with everything that you're presented with. And as I pleaded with everyone before we started these discussions, approach this with an open mind and look at both sides of the story, not just through a singular lens. Sheikh, any particular additional points that you've picked up from the Q&A that you wanted to address?
Nothing so far. But if there is anything that I think we can intervene, I'll let you know, inshallah. Thank you for asking.
Inshallah, fantastic. Severe allergies and anaphylaxis with the vaccine. Brother Ali Akbar, are you able to shed any light on that?
So, and perhaps because you're a GP and you've dealt with kind of childhood immunizations and other types of immunizations out there. So some people unfortunately have severe reactions to things, I was reading an opinion piece about, these two patients who developed these severe immunological reactions to the vaccine. And one of them, like, it was a prominent scientist, I believe, and I can find a source for this if it's relevant, but they said they thought it was purely coincidental. What are the chances of having two people having these reactions the first week? there is some sort of coincidence to it. However, for the more practical science side is that we won't know which people are predisposed to having certain reactions until trials are done, right? In this trial, some of the participants did have some long-standing issues, right? And they were excluded from the trial because there was a known factor in it. But it stands to reason that in general vaccination campaigns, some people unfortunately will just not be able to take them. And that's where the herd immunity kind of concept comes in, right? If I have an adverse reaction to something and I won't be able to take it, I'm hoping that I will be protected by those who can, right? At this juncture, I don't think it's too much to hone in on very focused on two people, right? And look at the bigger picture and assess the data for what it is. I think that's my conclusion here.
Absolutely. I mean, and from my point of view, I think with looking at anaphylaxis, when you look at someone who has never been exposed to an antibiotic, for example, so a child that you take to your GP for the very first time, you are 500 times more likely to develop anaphylaxis to penicillin than you are to this vaccine. Does that mean you'll stop taking your child to the GP? Does that mean you'll stop giving your child antibiotics for fear that they will suffer with anaphylaxis? No. So we know that there is a risk of anaphylaxis. We know that there's a risk of severe adverse effects, but actually in the grand scheme of the sort of things we put into our bodies, the risk of anaphylaxis with the vaccine is far outweighed by the risk of the other things that we do day to day.
And I think that's a very good point you mentioned. I think the risk-benefit ratio is something to really consider when thinking about getting vaccinated, right? I personally would rather look at the ratio of getting the vaccine as opposed to a natural infection if we're solely focusing on COVID as an infection.
Absolutely. Are you able to shed much light on the different vaccines that are currently in that are currently being researched? So we know about the mRNA vaccines, so the Moderna, the Pfizer, the adenovirus vaccine, which is the AstraZeneca one. People are asking about the Chinese vaccination, the Sputnik one in Russia, Janssen, Silson. Are you able to shed more light on those vaccines?
Yeah. So in the beginning of the pandemic, around the time where the front runners like Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca kind of said they're beginning to develop, there's about 30 to 40 candidates out there, right? Over time, they've still gone on and they're using similar technologies. Some of them, like the Chinese virus itself, is using one of the more traditional ones where you put the live attenuated virus, not a living one, but one that's kind of attenuated, so it's not able to infect, to elicit an immune response. The Sputnik one, it's the Russian one. They've started their vaccination campaign. Admittedly, I'm not too sure about that one, but they've started the vaccination campaign while the safety data is still being collected. I do intend to create some more content for those who are interested, diving more in depth about the other candidates out there. But I think the focus of this presentation was just for the one that's really out there right now and one that's being administered.
Brilliant. So there's a question here about if someone is tested positive for the virus, can they go on to have a vaccination? From what I understand, speaking to one of the leading virologists in the world, that's absolutely fine. It's not going to cause any harm. Brother Leopold, any difference to that?
No, I think I'd agree with you. Just from my knowledge, just immunologically, we don't know how long the infection can stay for COVID. So there would be no kind of competing efforts, because your natural immunity technically would wane over time, right? And it would be always good to get a vaccine to kind of boost that up. So I see no issue with it. But again, perhaps, more research is to be done. But from the top of my head, I don't think there would be an issue with that.
Sure. There's a question here about the risk of transverse myelitis with a vaccine. So it's a question specific to me, and it says that the NHS are no longer recommending Pfizer for those who have had a history of severe allergic reactions, but what about those who have had things like transverse myelitis? And so I actually put this question to one of the leading virologists in the world. He's been at the forefront of the pandemics, it's SARS, MERS, and such forth. And he said, actually, there is no cross-reactivity. There's no increase in risk of transverse myelitis in someone who's had transverse myelitis from a previous vaccination with this particular vaccination. So, inshallah, you are free to go ahead and have the vaccination without an increased risk. Sheikh, there's a question here about, is the COVID vaccine a way to get rid of excess unproductive members of the human race? And given that care home staff and healthcare workers are the first in line to receive this vaccination, I'm hoping that's not true. But any thoughts from your point of view, particularly in the context of the people receiving the vaccine, but also the importance of a working workforce to keep the population and economies going?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we stated earlier that we have to be able to reduce harm wherever we can. And I think when we understand that the vaccine is actually going to reduce the harm for the overall community and actually allow us to regain some sort of normalization in the medium to long term, then actually it wouldn't make sense to get rid of so many millions of people through this vaccination. If your starting point of your theory is that this is all about money and control, what is the benefit in getting rid of those very workers that you want them to go back to work to start putting money back in your pockets? So I'm not really convinced by that argument on any level.
Brilliant, fantastic, thank you. How long will vaccine immunity last? And we touched upon this earlier, didn't we, about the fact that antibodies, we're still unsure with COVID how long they're lasting. Any further thoughts on that specifically, that point specifically?
If I was to hazard a guess, I would suspect that we would need a booster dose. From natural infection, I think that the current estimates are probably 3 to 4 months, maybe 7, when immunity starts to wane. With vaccinations, I'm not too sure. I think that's beyond my pay grade at the time being. But I do suspect that we might need a booster shot, probably a year in. But I think that as the trial is ongoing, they'll probably shed more light on that.
We actually have a comment from a medical scientist, actually, who is involved with clinical trials on a day-to-day basis, and he knows how stringent the data analysis and reviewing process is, the fundamentals of bringing a vaccine or drugs out to members of the public. And he says that the vaccine was actually produced by BioNTech, and Pfizer only came in as a development partner much later down the line. They didn't have any involvement in the discovery or development of the vaccine. So those that are worried about Pfizer being involved, that Bill Gates has shares in Pfizer, etc., need not worry that the development and discovery was actually carried out by BioNTech, not Pfizer. And he concludes his statement by saying, please listen to the experts rather than reading Facebook posts. So I think what we'll do, inshallah, is move towards a conclusion, because I know that things are getting very late, and obviously we're getting a lot of questions through. I think Sheikh Jafar actually has a question specifically to him. Sheikh, do you want me to pass over to you, or do you want to?
I'll just read out the question that's been forwarded to me. Would this vaccine affect fertility issues in women?
Brother Ali Akbar?
I don't think they tested for pregnant women in this particular trial for Pfizer BioNTech. But I know that they will do some more research on that. Unfortunately, from my reading, cannot answer that question, but I'm happy to do some further reading in order to provide an answer in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. From my point of view, the reason why pregnant women were excluded from this trial is because of something that happens with antibodies and the transmission of antibodies from a pregnant mother to the fetus. So, for example, everyone that's been pregnant in the UK will know that they get something called anti-rhesus antibodies tested when they go for their booking appointment to the midwife. And this is to check whether they've had certain antibodies that could potentially be harmful to the child when they're giving birth, when the blood between the baby and the mother is mixing. And that's why they weren't included in the trial, because of the risk of those antibodies transferring over to the child. Will the vaccine harm fertility in women? Absolutely not, because otherwise they would have been excluded from receiving this vaccination, people of childbearing age. And all that we ask when we're vaccinating is that you avoid becoming pregnant for 2 months after the vaccination, and thereafter you're free to do as you wish. I think it's important to highlight 3 groups that can't have it. So we've talked about pregnant people, people who are children under 18, as well as those that have had severe anaphylaxis to vaccines before, or to any other medication for risk of anaphylaxis again. Now, we've got a poll that we put up before the webinar. And here we were asking do you plan to take the COVID-19 vaccination? And it was a very, very split response. So we've got 39 saying that they wanted to straight away, 24 no, not at all. 50 were on the fence, but 52 said that they wanted to after assessing the relevant data and information. Now, do we have any data on people who have since completed the questionnaire? I presume not.
No, but we are actually collecting that data. We just sent a link out, so hopefully we should have some.
Fantastic. So hopefully we're going to be sending a link out and assessing whether the discussions here have helped to enlighten you to decide one way or another. Okay, you will have full choice over the vaccination. I think that was another question that I didn't answer. People will have full choice. They can consent or withdraw their consent for the vaccination. It's not going to be mandatory. It's not going to be forced on you. All right. It's not a live vaccine as well, so it can be used in immunocompromised patients. So we know that that was another question that came in. People immunocompromised can have the vaccine. It's not live. It's not a live vaccine, so they absolutely can. So at this juncture, what I want to do is I want to pass over to Dr. Akbar, the president of COAGE, to say a few concluding words. And then inshallah, I think there's been a request that in honor of the great lady Sayyidah Zainab Salamullahi alayha that we recite a few lines of poetry, which inshallah I will do. And then we will conclude the evening there. So Dr. Akbar, please could you take the platform?
Akbar, unmute.
Thank you very much, Abbas. Everybody listening in, assalamu alaikum, and assalamu alaikum to the panel as well. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the three panelists, and I'll speak mixture of Gujarati and English. કે પહેલા તો શેખ જાફર લાડક કે ઈ આપને ધર્મની રીતે એવી રીતના સમજાવ્યા કે આપને આપની અક્કલને કેવી રીતના વાપરવી ને જે આપને આ બધું આવે છે ઇન્ફોર્મેશન ખાસ કરીને સોશિયલ મીડિયામાં ઈ આપને ધર્મ પ્રમાણે ને કુરાન ને હદીસ પ્રમાણે આપને કેવી રીતના એના ઉપર વિચારવું જોઈએ ને એને કેવી રીતના આપને અંદર મગજમાં લેવું જોઈએ કે ઈ આ જે આઈડિયાઝ જે આવે છે વોટ્સએપમાં ઈ જે આપણે ખાવાનું ખાય છે આપણી બોડી વાસ્તે આ મગજ વાસ્તે આપનો ખાવાનું છે ને એને આપણે કેવી રીતના સરખી રીતના વિચાર કરીને ટેકલ કરવું જોઈએ ને ઈ બહુ સરખી રીતના આપને સમજાવ્યા કે ધર્મના જે આપણા પ્રિન્સિપલ્સ છે કુરાન ને હદીસના ઈ આપને આ બાબત ઉપર કેવી રીતના આપને એને અપ્લાય કરી શકે ને એના ઉપર આપને વિચાર કરી શકે તો અસંત શેખ જાફર લાડક અલી અકબર દાતુ થેન્ક યુ વેરી મચ કે તમે અમને સમજાવી છે કે આટલો કોમ્પ્લેક્સ સબ્જેક્ટ સાયન્સનો કે તમારા ઇમેજીસ ને સ્લાઇડ્સથી કે સિમ્પલ લેંગ્વેજમાં ભાષામાં તમે અમને સમજાવી શક્યા એના વાસ્તે તમારો ઘણો ઘણો આભાર ને તમે જે સવાલો એ બધાય આન્સર કર્યા બધાયના કે માણસો સમજી શકે ને આઈ હોપ કે એ લોકો સમજી શકે ને તમે પાછો તમારા પર્સનલ કોન્ટેક્ટ ડિટેલ્સ આપ્યા છો કે કોઈને પણ કાંઈ સવાલો હોય તો તમે આપણા કોમ્યુનિટીના એક્સપર્ટ તરીકે તમે આન્સર કરો કે અહીંયા જે છે કે લગભગ 1/3 of the people હજી એ લોકોને ઇન્ફોર્મેશન જોઈએ છે પહેલા એ લોકો ડિસાઇડ કરે ને બીજા 1/3 people કે જે ઓલરેડી હજી અનડિસાઇડેડ છે કે એ લોકોને ઇન્ફોર્મેશન મળે તો તમારો ઘણો ઘણો આભાર ડોક્ટર અબ્બાસ તમારો આભાર એન્ડ થેન્ક યુ કે તમે લાઈક અ પ્રેક્ટિસિંગ જીપી જે રીતના હું છું દરરોજ પેશન્ટને જોઉં છું ને કોવિડનો શું અસર થયું છે અમારા પેશન્ટ ઉપર આપને સમજે છે કે કેટલાને ઈ મોત થઈ ગયા છે બીજો જો એનાલાઇઝ કરે તો એમાં જે 60-70 વર્ષના ઉપરના છે એમાં ઈ પર્સન્ટેજ ઘણો વધારે છે એટલે 1% ખાલી આપણે નાનું લાગે પણ આપણે જો ઓવર 60-70 year old નો એ મચ હાયર છે ને બીજું કે યંગર પીપલમાં આ થાય છે કે આપને લાગે કે આપને નાના છે તો આપને છે ને એમાં અસર નહીં કરે. એક સવાલ હતો કે ક્યારે અમારી ચાન્સ આવશે અમને વેક્સિનેશન મળવાની, તો ઈ છે કે ગવર્મેન્ટ જે સ્ટેજીસમાં નાખ્યા છે ઈ ગ્રુપિંગમાં કે હમણાં જે હેલ્થ કેર વર્કર્સ છે ઈ ને 80 year ઉપરના 80 વર્ષ ઉપરનાને મળવાનું છે પહેલા વેક્સિન. તો ઈ છે ને કે આસ્તે બધી ગ્રુપ ઓવર ધ નેક્સ્ટ 3-4-6 મહિનામાં બધાને ચાન્સ મળશે કે ઈ લોકો અને વેક્સિનેશન મળી શકે. એટલે 30-40 વર્ષના પછી લોકોની બધાની ટર્ન આવશે વેક્સિનની. બીજું ડોક્ટર બાસ થેન્ક યુ કે તમે જે સોશિયલ મીડિયાના જે ઇન્ફોર્મેશન છે એના ઉપર તમે ઓપિનિયન આપ્યા કે આપને જે સવાલો આવ્યા છે હું જોતો હતો કે ઈ જે સવાલો આપને આ પેનલને પૂછવામાં આવ્યા ઈ જો ઓર્ડિનરી માણસો ઈ જે સવાલો જે ઈ લોકોને આ વોટ્સએપ મેસેજ મોકલાવે છે ને જે મિસઇન્ફોર્મેશન આવે છે ઈ લોકોને જો એટલા જ સવાલ પૂછે તો ઈ લોકોને જવાબ મળી શકે કે નહીં ને એના ઉપર ઈ લોકો વિચાર કરે. આટલું સોશિયલ મીડિયામાં આપનું છે આ બાબત ઉપર ને ઈ પહેલા કહી ગયા છે કે ઈ ટાર્ગેટેડ છે BME કોમ્યુનિટી, એથનિક માઇનોરિટી કોમ્યુનિટી અને મેજોરિટી મુસલમાન આપને એથનિક માઇનોરિટી કોમ્યુનિટીના છે કે આપને જ ઈ કોમ્યુનિટી છે કે જેનાથી આપને સૌથી વધારે ફાયદો ઉઠાવી શકે. ને અનફોર્ચ્યુનેટ છે કે આ સોશિયલ મીડિયાનો ટાર્ગેટિંગ ઈ આ BME કોમ્યુનિટી ઉપર જ છે. એટલે આપને વિચાર આવે કે આ જે લોકો કરે છે આટલા મિસઇન્ફોર્મેશન ને ઈ કોન્સ્પિરસી થિયરીઝ ઈ શું કામ જેને ખાસ ફાયદો થવાનો છે એના ઉપર જ આ કરે છે. એના ઉપર આપને જરાક વિચાર કરવો જોઈએ. મારી ઈ રિસ્પોન્સિબિલિટી હતી કે આટલો સોશિયલ મીડિયામાં સાંભળી ને મને થયું કે હું કોઈના પ્રેસિડેન્ટ તરીકે શું કરી શકું. તો હું એક ચીજ કર્યો કે ગઈકાલે મને જ્યારે ઓપોર્ચ્યુનિટી મળી કે વેક્સિન ખાવાની તો હું જઈને ખાઈ આવ્યો ગઈકાલે મારો પહેલો ડોઝ ને મારો બીજો ડોઝ છે 7મી જાન્યુઆરીના. ને તમે જો છો કે હું હજી જીવું છું ને આ ડાબા આમમાં હું ખાધો છો ને આમે મારો સરખો છે કાંઈ એને થયું નથી. જરાક ત્યાં દબાવ તેમ લાગે કે મને ઇન્જેક્શન હું ખાધો છો. કે આપણે ન કે આપને બોલવાથી કરના એક્શન સ્પીક્સ લાઉડર ધેન વર્ડ્સ. મને થયું કે હું એક્શન કરીને બતાવું ને જેને જોતું હતું કે મારો ફોટો જ્યાં એ લોકોને યુઝ કરવો હોય મને કેટલા મોકલાવ્યા કે અમે યુઝ કરી શકીએ. હું કે હા જરૂર, કે મને એમ થયું કે મારી ડ્યુટી છે કે હું પબ્લિસાઇઝ કરું કે જેને ઓલો કોન્ફિડન્સ ન હોય કે આ વેક્સિન તો એ લોકોને થાય કે આ ડોક્ટર અકબર ને હું એટ રિસ્ક કેટેગરી છું. હું એક તો આપણે એથનિક માઇનોરિટી ને બીજો મારી એજ ઓવર 60 છે તો હાયર રિસ્ક કેટેગરી. એટલે મારો રિસ્ક ને મને વિચાર આવ્યો કે કોવિડ જો મને થાય એનું એટલું વધારે રિસ્ક છે ને જો મને થાય ને એના પછી મને લોંગ કોવિડ જે ડોક્ટર અબ્બાસ કહી ગયા કે 1 in 5 ને લોંગ ટર્મ કોમ્પ્લિકેશન્સ રહે છે. ઈ તો હજી હમણાં આપણે છેલ્લા 2 મહિનામાં ખબર પડવા આવે છે કે કોવિડ એક ફેરે થઈ ગયો હોય એમાંથી આપણે સર્વાઈવ થયા હોય પછી એનું નુકસાન કેટલું છે ને આપણી લાઈફ ને કેટલી ડિસેબિલિટી કરશે એનું હજી હમણાં ખબર પડે છે. એટલે ઈ વિચારી કરીને હું બધાને અર્જ કરું છું ને મેસેજ આપવા માંગે કે તમે જરા ઇન્વેસ્ટિગેટ કરો, તમારી અક્કલ વાપરો ને એમાં પછી તમે ડિસિઝન કરો કે તમને વેક્સિનેશન ખાવી છે કે નહીં. ઈ તમારો પડશે. તમને જો પર્સનલ તમારા અમે પર્સનલ એકજણને એડવાઇસ ન કરી શકે પણ તમે તમારા ડોક્ટર સાથે ડિસ્કશન કરી ને વિચાર કરો કે આ વેક્સિન લેવી કે ન લેવી. પણ હું એક્ઝામ્પલ મારો આપ્યો છો કે હું ને મારી ફેમિલીને બધાને હું એડવાઇસ કરું છું કે આ વેક્સિન લે. તો ઘણો આભાર જે લોકો જોઈનિંગ થયા હોય. આઈ હોપ તમને લોકોને ફાયદો થયો હોય ને ઇન્શાલ્લાહ આ અવેલેબલ હશે યુટ્યુબમાં ને આ આપનો આ હમણાં વેબિનાર પતશે પછી અમે ડિસ્કસ કરશું કે બીજા ક્વેશ્ચન જે આન્સર ન થયા હોય કે ઈ કેવી રીતના આન્સર કરી શકે એના ઉપર અમે ચર્ચા કરશું ઇન્શાલ્લાહ. તમને અલ્લાહ બધાને સેફ રાખે ને આપને દુઆ કરે અલ્લાહ પાસે કે આપને આ કોવિડ માંથી આપણે એઝ અ વર્લ્ડ કોમ્યુનિટી આપણે બધાય ભેગા છે આમાં આપણે ઇઝીલી નીકળી જાય ને આપને અલ્લાહ એટલી અક્કલ આપે કે આપને રાઈટ ડિસિઝન આપના વાસ્તે કરી શકે ને આપની કોમ વાસ્તે ને આપની ફેમિલી વાસ્તે ઇન્શાઅલ્લાહ. વસ્સલામુ અલૈકુમ વરહમતુલ્લાહિ વબરકાતુહુ.
Jazakallah, Dr. Akbar, President of COEG, giving his wise words in Gujarati. So just a few lines of poetry to end in honor of Sayyidah Zainab Salamullahi alayha. As you know, it's her birthday. So this session would not be complete without invoking her blessed name. And when I was thinking about what to recite, I realized that everything, every fiber of her being throughout her life, from the moment she was born until the moment that she sadly passed away and she was buried, every fiber of her being was her attempt to replicate the name of her mother, Sayyidah Fatima Salamullahi alayha. And so I wanted to recite something in honor of her mother, as she was known as Sania Zahra. You are the Prophet's daughter, whose blood runs in your veins, who brought Islam to us and the whole world knows his name. You are the wife of Haydar, the mother of Hussein, who gave his life for his deen and suffered so much pain. Fatima, wherever you are, the truth goes. You are the Prophet's precious rose. Your status only Allah knows. Fatima, you are the lady of the light. You are the highest of the high, the light of our Prophet's eyes. You taught us how to live life, you showed us how to care. You taught us how to give and you showed us how to share. You emphasized on morals and trained us to be fair. No matter if we're paupers or even billionaires. Fatima, your qualities, how can I write? You are the lady of the light, the one that shines out strong and bright. You are the hidden diamond, you are the shining star. You are the scent of heaven, your love flows in my heart. I always feel your presence, you're never very far. Whenever I am wounded, you always heal the scar. Fatima, you are the holy prophet's pride. I will follow you stride for stride. You are my leader and my guide. And I want to finish with this final verse. The angels send their blessings upon you all the time. You are the purest lady and are the prophet's sign. The household that you come from is sacred and divine. For you in heaven there is a special place assigned. Fatima, your father always said of you, you are so honest and so true. There is no one with your virtue. Fatima. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. On behalf of all of us, thank you very much for tuning in, for your questions, for your participation. Inshallah, we wish you all the best for your health and your safety and your prosperity. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.